led by Chaplain Lieutenant Colonel Jared Vineyard. He is a native of Mount Zion, Illinois, and a 2002 graduate of the United States Military Academy.
Be Navy.
Upon graduation, he commissioned and began his Army career as a field artillery officer. He commissioned as an Army chaplain in 2009. He currently serves as the ethicist at the Center for Army Leadership and as the Deputy Command Chaplain for the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He was most recently the ethics instructor and writer at the Maneuver Center of Excellence, and then the brigade chaplain for the 197th Infantry Brigade at Fort Benning, Georgia. He has deployed as a field artillery officer to Iraq and as a chaplain to Afghanistan. He has 2 graduate degrees, a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in 2008, and a Master's of Sacred Theology from Yale Divinity School in 2019. He is currently pursuing his PhD in Christian Ethics and Public Theology from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Please join us in welcoming Chaplain Jared Vineyard.
All right. Hey, thanks so much for having me. We've got just about an hour, give or take. It's good to be back. I was here for 5 years, and so coming back last night, kind of had the little one tear, like, oh, I love this place. So Gil, thanks publicly for picking me up, and it was great. Yeah, Gil saw that nostalgic, like, oh, this is a great place. So it's good to be back. So I wrote down the topic, preparing the soul for war. Now we're heavy on chaplains today. So some of the questions I ask, you may have thought about, just because you're not a chaplain doesn't mean you haven't thought about it. I just start the conversation this afternoon was, so how are you preparing your soul for war? And drop the war, how are you preparing your soul for those sucky days? Like, if you're not preparing your soul for war, the whole discussion is just irrelevant. Right? Oh, we're going to talk notionally about how we prepare our souls for war, but if I'm not personally doing it right now, or I don't have a plan to do it, then we're probably not in a great place. And so I would ask you, first off, everybody in this room is a leader in the Army. How are you preparing your soul for war? And again, just mentally, what would be, here's how I'm doing it. Now, I would say, when it comes to that, there isn't a right answer, right? I think there's a range of probably yes, maybe. There's some wrong answers, though. There are some definite wrong answers, and I can tell you one of them without being, too controversial. The wrong answer is to not be. So if I'm not preparing my soul for war, I'm already wrong. So that would be what I just throw at you first, is how are you preparing your soul for just life, for doing life? And then, how are you stewarding the people that the United States government has given you? Chaplain Kuhlman this afternoon at lunch asked me, hey, say something real quick. And so immediately, I just looked at something this morning, and it was from a 1966 character guide, and it says, the phrasing in 1966, better men make better soldiers. I would say better people make better soldiers. But that was from doctrine in 1966. The United States Army believed, at least in writing, that better people make better soldiers. And the question was asked earlier, do you believe you have a soul? You do. What's the difference between you and an animal, like a dog or a cat? It's the soul. Right, we could debate on that, but the difference of humanity with everything else is the soul. Now you maybe call the spirit the soul, and there's a theological debate, but let's just for once, there's a difference between you in this room and everything else in this world, period. It's called the soul. Makes us different. Makes us plan out 5 and 10 years, where the animal's like, I want food today, right? I'm hungry. And we're just different. How are you preparing your soul right now? And how are you preparing the men and women that serve with you for their bad days? Again, I mentioned at lunch, 1949, the Army said, the people that you're in charge of should be better because you've been in charge of them. I want you to think about that. If you're an instructor, the people that you instruct should be better because you've instructed them. Or are you just forgettable? You're just one of those forgettable people that comes and goes. And, when I was at West Point, I can't even tell you it's just no memory. There's certain things, and it wasn't because there's moral injury. There was no memory. I just have no, because it was so forgettable. And there's some people that really left a mark. Chaplain John Cook, man, that was a guy who just left a mark. Just the conversations that I had with them. Dr. Kellner's one of these guys, not to call you out, but I've talked to people who've talked to people and Dr. Kellner is a guy that he leaves a mark. In a good way. Because there's bad ways to leave a mark too, right? And so there's forgettable people, there's unforgettable people on either end of the spectrum, sort of that Aristotelian mean, right? There's really, really good people that you don't want to forget, there's really, really bad people you don't want to forget. And those people in the middle are forgettable. And again, that's sort of the inverse of it. But my challenge for you is this: how are you, and I'm totally off script and we haven't even started, but that's okay. How are you preparing your soul, period? How are you preparing the soul for the men and women that you interact with? Because I've come to realize that we can create programs and we can write doctrine and we can do stuff. The only thing that lasts is these relationships we're making. That's what's going to last. And not that the other stuff is wrong, the systems need to happen, the doctrine needs to be written, everything needs to be there. But these relationships, they're the things that last. And so I guess I just start off by asking that question. I was asked to talk about teaching and training the professional ethic for LSCO. That's what I was asked to talk about. So I will be tight in doctrine, current doctrine. And I would tell you, I think our doctrine is wanting. I think it's good. I think what we have is good. I just don't think it's deep enough. I don't think it's wide enough, but we've got what we got. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit where we've got just a little bit and talk about it. And these are the three questions I'm just going to ask us this afternoon is why train the professional ethic for LSCO? All right. So if I'm tasked with teaching and training the professional ethic for LSCO, why would be the first question. The second question is, what is the professional ethic? All right, and that's fair. Maybe that's the first question, but I'll ask them in this order. And then the third one is, so how? So then how do you do it? Why do we do it? What even is it? And then how do we train it? I think they mentioned Frankel this morning. I forget who mentioned it. I think Grossman mentioned it. He quotes Nietzsche who says, he who has a why can do about any what. Right? If you've got purpose, you can get through it. So that's a super mistranslation of Frankel. But if you've never read it, and I would encourage it, Man's Search for Meaning, it's sort of out there. It's his experience as a psychologist, psychiatrist from being in a camp and then writing about it. It's a great book. So why train the professional ethic? And let me even ask a question before I do that. When do you start? When does this start? And it's just that's a real question.
Now. It's already won.
Yeah, that's right. Why? Because if my training on the professional ethics, character, all the above, if it starts right before we deploy with the ROE brief, then we are already in a world of hurt. And that's the first time we've heard how to do things the right and the wrong way. And I'll share real quick, the reason I got passionate about this topic, I was prior service officer, but when I came back as a chaplain in 2009, I came to a battalion that was not, we weren't going to deploy anywhere. We were with the 101st and 2506 Infantry, and I had a commander who I absolutely love and adore, just recently retired, and he had two big things. There's two things we're going to do. We'd always talk about these two things we're going to do. We're going to run and we're going to shoot. And he shows up. I showed up about 2 or 3 weeks before him, and he rolled in hot and heavy and said, we're going to run and we're going to shoot. And there's this great sigh across the battalion. Oh, not the shooting, but the running, right? And we sure did. We ran and we shot, and I'm the chaplain. So I ran and watched people shoot, and ran and watched people shoot. And then all of a sudden, I think how it played out is there was a hurricane in Haiti. The 82nd shifted stuff. President Obama did a surge, and all of a sudden, we who were not going to deploy we're getting ready to kick out the door in 6 months. And for the commander, what he had said is this: you got to run and you got to shoot, and you got to shoot and you got to run, and you got to run and shoot and run. And then he comes to my office and he said this: Jared, we've been talking a lot about running and shooting. Can you help me? They need to do this ethically. And I was like, oh, right? And this was my first intro and figure this out. Right, and we came up with I look back, it's one of those where you look back and you're like, it's like I did it with my left hand in a crown, I'm right-handed, and I was like, this is so terrible, but at the time, it's what I had, and we just did the best we could. We had 3 sessions with every soldier in the battalion. Pre-deployment, I had a session with every soldier during the deployment, and we had a session with every soldier after the deployment. And it's sort of what we concocted. And I think it was okay for what we did. And so, yeah, when is the time you start talking about, the professional ethic? The answer is now, right? Because then it is too late, all right? So why train the professional ethic? Let me even ask another question related to this. What's the inverse? What's the opposite? What's the other option? To not. And I'll use this as an example of the not. For my PhD program, I'm having to do Latin. And so, and I've never taken Latin. And so I'm like, oh, I can actually use my Latin. And I'm going to show you in English what it says. Yeah, it's just, if you're a person of prayer, pray for me. I got a final coming up, and I got to be able to read everything in Latin. I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to do this. In 52 BC, Cicero was asked to give a defense to his buddy Titus, or the Latin Tito Ennio Milone. And so he was asked to give a defense because Tito Milone basically murdered a dude along the Appian Way. And so Cicero gives up to give a defense for his friend, and the context was a warring situation, and Cicero basically makes the argument, in time of war, law is silent. The rules are just different. The rules in war they're just different. In fact, there's no rules in war, or only the rules that we enforce. Now, when you hear that, what do you think? In time of war, law is silent.
I think that the moral law is always there.
Yes.
And then the question is, how well does our positive law reflect it?
Yes. If I'm a positive lawyer, positive jurist, the government creates the law, and so it's whatever the government says. But if I think there's something, a moral law rooted in nature itself, then there's something that always applies. I mean, we would go back to Nuremberg to say the United States government believes that. Nuremberg, the argument was what? We're just following orders. We're following the law, literally. The law says we're going to do this. And we had to reply, but that was illegitimate based on something higher, right? So that was illegitimate. Now this was a pagan Roman take. Pagan, that wasn't the pagan Roman take. There was different views in Rome, but a pagan Roman take of law. Very quickly, pagan Rome flips to Christian Rome. Things begin to change. Some of you are familiar with just war theory. That gets brought in from kernels of Greco-Roman thought and idea that Christian theologians began to wrestle with, and Western jurists ended up codifying. And it's about 2,000 years of discussion, and just war theory is still just discussion. It's just, hey, these are some areas we think why we should go to war, how we should fight in war. But what I would tell you is the American way of war. I'm at CGSC, right? Or where CGSC is. So we talk about the American way of war at CGSC. The American way of war says no to this. This is not acceptable. This is not okay. The American way of war rejects that. This is an anomaly. But there have been anomalies in the American system where this has happened. You know, and when I was here as an instructor, one of the examples I would say is a lieutenant who got trained here, who then in 1968 oversaw the My Lai massacre. This is where he was trained, right here. William Calley. This is where he came back to be held on confinement, right here. There's a little marker over by the CG's house that says this is where his trial was. The place is burned down. There's a field, but you can see it. This is the My Lai massacre, probably the biggest stain in the Vietnam War, but probably one of the biggest stains in American military history. He was trained right here, and he had classes on how to do things, but he didn't follow it, right? He didn't follow it. And so what I would say is that is an anomaly and should be an anomaly. Because we've got a lot of good examples too. For every Calley, there's a Hugh Thompson. And if you know the story, Hugh Thompson's the helicopter pilot that went down and was like, hey, you got to stop this now, right? So for every Calley, there's a Thompson. There's a great book, and I've used it a number of times. It's called The Code of the Warrior by Shannon French. And one of her stories from that Vietnam War is, you know, these guys had, and I think they're Marines, but the Marines had been in the mix for days. And it had been rough, right? The combat had been rough, and the Vietnamese were doing some rough things. One of the times, you know, I was just teaching a class at another place, and one of the things we talked about is you have to follow these rules. The assumption is your enemies won't, right? That's the assumption. They might, but they probably won't. Which means you got to train harder and be better than them, because they're going to do everything to cheat, right? But in the firefight, you know, they captured this young Viet Cong. They hog-tied him. They threw him down, and you can imagine what's about to happen. Young private goes up, puts the the muzzle on this dude's temple, and this leader, Marine leader, was walking down the line and saw it, and went by and just popped the muzzle off the guy's temple, and he looked back and he said one sentence: Marines don't do that. Marines don't do that. Man, this guy got a class on the professional ethic. Right? Man, this guy got an ethics instruction. This guy got, you know, professionalism 101, all in one phrase. Marines don't do that. The American military has never bought into this. That doesn't mean we haven't had members that have done this. And I would go back, I think the first in writing, and you could go back to George Washington, and George Washington's general orders have got a number of just awesome things in it. But I always go back in U.S. Army history to the Civil War in 1863 to just as a great example of the American Army has rejected this, why we do it. The American Army has said no. General Order 100, signed by Abraham Lincoln. General Order 100, the background of General Order 100 is there was an immigrant to the United States. He had served against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, Francis Lieber. He was Prussian. He was a German. All right. He had a very young man. He had served at Waterloo. He was a law professor at Columbia University at the time the Civil War began. He's friends with what we would call the Chief of Staff, General Halleck at the time. They're friends. As the war kicks off, Lieber knows war is terrible because he's seen it as a young man. And so what Lieber says to Halleck is, we need some sort of code to say we got to have some restraint because we reject this. We just rejected this idea. Halleck is on board. Yeah, 100%. Him and Halleck go back and forth. Others are involved. They're called the Lieber Codes. They're presented eventually to Abraham Lincoln, who signs the Lieber Codes. And I forget, I think there's 150 articles in the Lieber Code, give or take. But Article 15, to me, is so telling because it's sort of the point of the Lieber Code. Men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings, responsible to one another and to God. There is inherent responsibility that you have in war and outside of war. And that responsibility doesn't go away. You mentioned the moral law. It doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear like Cicero would have us to believe. And let's just be honest, we all know that. We all kind of know that inside because it's just ingrained in. Are we our brother's keeper? Yes. Yeah. Are we our sister's keeper? Who asked that question? Cain. If you remember the story, God said, yeah. And then he said, watch out, because sin's crouching at your door. You're going to be so tempted to do the wrong thing. When are we tempted to do the wrong thing? Well, all the time. But it becomes harder when things around us are hard. And so the American Army has rejected that. Let me just give you, and so, if you've been around me, many of you have, because I was here forever. This was my money slide I always go back to. When I teach Army ethics, I will always start with this, and we riff off of this. But I always come back to this idea. This is who at least we say we are as profession. And this is who we are as professionals, therefore in the profession, made up of Army civilians and the green suiters. When you look at the definition of who we are, what do we do? Who are we? And I'll just boil it down to the center. It's I've got a click or a pointer. What am I doing? So I'm gonna point to it, and you're all gonna say it. It's the what? Ethical. Okay, I know there's not many of us, but there's like 3 voices. So let's all try this. All right, I'm going to point to it, and you're going to say, remember that, like as a kid, the little sing-alongs where you bounce around? We're going to do that, all right? We're going to do this little sing-along. Don't sing. But you're going to say the word I'm pointing to. You ready? Here we go.
Ethical, design, generation, support, and application of manpower.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to point again, and I want you to say what I point to.
Ethical, application of manpower.
Okay. I'm trying to simplify it as simple as I can. So the design is to apply, right? The generation is to apply. The support is to apply. I'll make the argument, it's all of the above, but the application of land power is what we focus on. Now again, particularly the maneuver center, right? The maneuver center is what we focus on, the application of land power. What is the application of land power? It's what?
Killing people?
It's killing. Yeah. Now, is it more than killing? Yeah, I think it is, right? But I've done this before. But is it less? It's not less, right? It's killing. And again, is it more than killing? Sure. But it's not less than killing. So think about it. Put the word killing in there. So it's what? Ethical killing. This is why we're talking about it. Because who kills? Well, pirates kill and mobs kill and, but we're not pirates and we're not mobs and there's got to be something different from us. And it was mentioned in there already before. There's a difference between just killing and murder. Right? And I say this a lot. Every murder is a killing, but every killing is not a murder. And you as Army leaders have got to know that, first of all, and own that, and you got to be teaching that. I can tell you, the last time I was deployed, I was in a firefight, right? It happened right as I'm around, and so I'm in with this infantry, this group of infantrymen, and we're in a place close to Cap Munoz in Pactica province, and we're in a firefight. And I'm just there as the chaplain, just there, right? There wasn't a lot to help out with. I guess there could have been if it went wrong, but after it was over, I can just remember this big infantryman. He walks up to me. He says, "Chaplain, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Yeah, man, what's up?" I was like, "Man, this was crazy. This was wild, right?" And he's like, "Can we go back here?" Yeah. So we go back here, and this guy, he's probably 6'3", big, looked like a linebacker. He comes back and I noticed his eyes started misting. He said, could you just tell me why I'm not a murderer? Now I'll pause because I had to ask him some probing questions because he might have been. Right? I don't know. You may be a murderer, man. I don't know. Well, he wasn't. He had been in that firefight and he'd just been real close and he watched the whole thing and now we are in a discussion of what is it? And fortunately, I had like 3 hours. And so we were able to philosophically and theologically parse it out. So I could tell him, man, you're not a murderer. You know, Augustine would say, you know, sometimes love dictates death. Sometimes. Love of neighbor sometimes means killing of neighbor. Because they're killing the other neighbors. Sometimes. And we were able to parse that out and have a deep discussion about it. Yeah, he's a killer. But you're not a murderer. And while there may be, and we've all done this, and you don't have to go into combat to know this, sometimes you can make the right decision with the right intent, and the goal is right, and there's still emotions that are attached to it. And right now, we're dealing with, you know, civilian cuts where I'm at. There's some hard decisions that are going to be made. I've got civilian leaders coming to me saying, Chaplain, I got to make some cuts. And some of these cuts are needed. I'm just going to be honest. Some of these cuts are needed in what I'm seeing. But they're saying it's still hard because there's still real people associated with it. And it's like, yeah. And they're like, this isn't right. I'm not making the right decision. I'm like, well, is the job needed? Well, you know, have you been told to do this? Yeah. And you know, but I know Joe. I said, you know what? It's okay. It's okay. I said, I would have issues if you didn't have emotions. You'd be like a robot then. You know, these cuts are meaning loss, and loss, grief follows, and so there's going to be grief. So grieve with them. But you're not wrong. So what I would say is, going back to this is what we're talking about, ethical. What we train to do in the military. And so one of the things that I would beat the drum while I was here is this: every time we train lethality, we should be training ethicality right along with it. There ought to be that simultaneous. Every time I'm teaching someone how to pull the trigger, I better be telling them how to think about pulling the trigger. And if I'm not, I'm doing them a disservice. I just am. Because if all I'm worried about is the mechanics, the physical mechanics of killing, and never talk about the emotional, spiritual mechanics of it, the morality of it, then we're doing our junior soldiers a disservice. Now you may say, well, I'm not an expert on that. That's okay, you don't have to be. But you should get somebody who is. Or learn about what it is. And again, we're going to talk about it, but this is why we're talking about it today. It goes back to the idea of this is who we say we are. Now, if we said we were something different, then I wouldn't show this slide. This is who we say we are. We're ethically designed, and you put that ethical with everything. We ethically design it, right? We ethically generate. We ethically support it. We ethically apply it. Now, what kind of person is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. That's a person of character. Because a person of character can ethically do these things. Now, is it true a bad person can make good decisions? Yes. But a better person will probably make better decisions. Right? And a good person can make bad decisions, but that's what we're getting after. That's what I appreciated with Dr. Kellner's today. Like, we got to think about this character development thing, not as we got this, but as, I don't know if we do, but we need to be thinking about it. And so this is why we're talking about it. So that goes to the question of why do we talk about it? Well, thank you. Okay, we're talking about it. Let me pause real quick. What's my time? What's the end time for this? 45. Sir. 45. All right, good. Because we will end on time. So that's great. What is the professional ethic? What is the professional ethic? Not you. No. Yeah, not Dr. Keller. But for my, what is the professional? Could you write it down? So, you may have been in my class. I don't know if you were. When I was teaching PCC here, I'm going to tell you what happened when I was teaching PCC. I used to give them a gotcha test. I used to have, and I know things have changed, but I had 2 hours with every 05 and 06 that came in. So maneuver 05 and 06, they would come here for 2 weeks. And again, I know it's changed, I think it moved to a week, but regardless, they would come here and I would get 2 hours of ethics instruction. I loved it. But I'll be honest, when I first started teaching it, I was a major at the time. You know, here's this major who's a chaplain who's walking into infantry and armor 05s and 06s, and you knew what they were thinking. Ethics, chaplain, bleh, like this is going to be the worst, right? And I was a little intimidated, I'd be honest. I was like, ooh. I wouldn't show it. I mean, you could, because then you're like the shark. The sharks just start eating you. But I was like, ugh. So one day it hit me. I did a few sessions of it, and then it hit me. I don't think these guys know as much as they think they do when it comes to this. So I made a gotcha test, and what I did is it was a 1-pager, 10 questions, fill in the blank, and at the end of every sentence, I had where in doctrine it was. So again, I'm not making stuff up. This isn't like Jared thinks this is important. No, I'm just pulling stuff from Army doctrine. Then what I would do is I got an okay to do it, so it wasn't unethical. I would tell them, I'd walk in, gentlemen, welcome. Hey, I need you to take everything and put it on the floor, and they'd be like, and I would say, on behalf, of General Donahoe, I want to welcome you here. We're going to give you a little test that we're going to do a little OML off of to see where you're at when it comes to the area of the profession, character, and leadership of the United States Army. And they'd be like, what? Yeah, like, what is, but I was on it. I'd be like, all right, hey, all right, put your stuff down. No phones. I had to do no phones. I didn't do it the first time because the first time I had dudes like, oh no, get off the phone. So what I would do is I'd pass it. I said, the number one thing I need you to do is put your name on it because I need to know who does it. And I would pass them out face down. I say, gentlemen, I'm going to give you 10 minutes. Begin. And they're like, So now all of a sudden, like they're in. They think they're getting graded. They're in. And what I would do was, I would just ask basic questions. The first question on the top is the Army ethic is, and there was a little blank section. Write the Army ethic. And then the next question was, it was just stuff like that, but I would show and dot where it was, and this would be what they did. They would start, they would do, I'd say, all right, put your name on it. They put their name on it, and then no one would put their pen on the paper. Because they'd go to the next question, and they couldn't answer it. And they go to the next question, they couldn't answer it. And about 30 seconds in, they would just be dead silence. You'd usually have a guy do, like, is anybody else, and I would usually say, oh, gentlemen, the time started. You can start. And then and I'd stop them at a point. And I'd say, could we bring some humility to the room and just say, we're going to learn something today. I said, you're going to be able to answer all the questions on this paper at the end of it. And I was like, it's not graded. They're all like, oh, right. The last question is the Army values are. And they could, the guy at the end was like, oh, I got that. And there'd always be one that jumped to the end, like, go to the last one. You can get it, right? And now listen, just because I know what it says doesn't mean I'm going to do it. But how can I expect people to do it when I don't know what it says? Or if I am doing it, it's unintentional, professionally. It might be because I'm a good person, whatever that means. Right? I'm doing the Army values, not because I know them. I'm a Christian, so the Army values are no big deal. I just do those anyways, and so I live the Army values, not because I know the Army values, just because that's who I am. Right? So if we're going to lead intentional organizations that are intentionally doing the right thing, it presupposes we know what the right thing even is, what it even looks like. So my question would be, what is the Army ethic? Well, I would argue before Dr. Snyder, and some of you know who he is or was, or not was, he's still alive, but who he is. I had Dr. Snyder on 9/11. On 9/11, so as the towers are getting hit, my senior year at West Point, I have Dr. Snyder. So does anybody know who I'm talking about? I'm sorry, you brought, Dr. Snyder's like a legend. And my class, as the towers are getting hit, was on terrorism. I walk into a class on terrorism. He's got it on. He's watching it. We thought it was like a pre-rehearsed, like, oh, that's crazy. What a cool way to segment on terrorism. And we were like, that's actually real. And then in a movie moment, he just stood there. He didn't say a word for about 15 minutes. And there's 15 of us in the class, and he mutes it, and he's like, gentlemen, your nation has been attacked. It's now at war. Class dismissed. Report back to the barracks. Wait for further instructions. We're like, okay. Okay. Anyways, I think before Dr. Snyder, and you maybe correct me if I'm wrong, sir, I don't know if the Army ethic was defined or described. I think it's always been, but I think Dr. Snyder is the one who really put words to idea. And I'll give you the Army ethic as it stands in doctrine today. And some of you have seen this, and some of you know this. This is the Army. The Army ethic is a set of enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the profession and create a culture of trust essential to the Army professionals in the conduct of missions, performance of duty, and all aspects of life. This is how we describe the Army ethic today. Now, there's two things going on here. The first thing is the definition. What I would argue is the second part is sort of what it is and what it does. What does the Army ethic do in theory? Well, look at the verb. It guides and it creates. That's what it does, but that's not what it is. What is it? And enduring moral principles, values, and beliefs, and laws. This is the idea of the ethic as it stands in doctrine today. So, what do I mean? What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you take that definition and you sort of break it out with the conjunction being sort of the break, you have the idea that the Army ethic, to act ethically within an Army construct, means to act legally and morally. I mean, this is kind of the basic idea. Now, why am I talking about this? Because this is what I've got to understand before I get to LSCO. Because this is going to apply in LSCO, but it applies apart from LSCO too. So in order to be ethical, so to speak, following the Army ethic, one must do what's legal, and one must do what's moral. And they're different. They're different. Now, I would argue the easier one is this, because that means it's writing somewhere. The more powerful one is this. And I would argue this actually makes this. Now, again, this gets into a legal debate, but, you know, all law is morality. It's all morality. It's just codified. It's codified morality. I don't agree with that. Okay, that's what it is. Like somebody made a value judgment, you should go like ridiculously slow on all military posts, right? So we just go ridiculously slow because somebody made a value judgment that we will go ridiculously slow. So what we've done, following Dr. Kelly, we've habituated over time that every time I'm on a military post, I know I need to go ridiculously slow because it's always 15 miles an hour here or 10 miles an hour there, and so that's just what I do. And so when we think about training the Army ethic, the professional ethic, which is the Army ethic, we need to understand legal and moral. And again, I've used this with people here before. So I need to, legal is what you will do based on what? National law, state law, organizational policy, Army regulation. Moral is what you ought to do based on what? Well, I'll just give you what 622 says, based on conscience. Organizational conscience, individual conscience. And I put individual here purposely. Army doctrine does mention individual because the Chinese Army would agree with this model minus this. Yep, this is great. That's not sort of irrelevant. The American Army, I mean, we have a place for that. And so why do I have, well, let me even go back. So we the people, what document is that? Constitution. All right, the United States Army looks at the United States Constitution, rightly so, as the foundational legal document of our nation. Now, there's other laws, right? There's statutes, but this is the foundational legal document of our nation. It is a constitution, but it is law. The United States Army looks at this document, July 4, 1776, which is Declaration of Independence, as the foundational moral document of our nation. Because if you read it, this is really a moral argument. What the Declaration is a moral argument. It's a moral argument, not a legal document. It works with legality because what this document says is the king has abdicated his legal throne. And we're not leaving him, he's already left us. And you look in the meat of this document for he has. It's just an immoral argument. We don't want to leave. He's just left us. And he's left us no other choice. Right now, you can agree or disagree with the argument, but it's a moral argument. And that's a moral argument grounded in higher morality. Because, well, shoot, let me just not paraphrase, right? So I would encourage, I think every officer needs to have one of these. And when I was here, I used to have boxed them. Some of you know, I would giving them out. Like the t-shirt gun, I'd show up and be like, the Constitution gun. Boof, boof. But I'll tell you, everybody had one. I'll just read you, and some of you know this, but when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a people to dissolve political bands, right? Because that's the point. We're dissolving political bands. Why? Because he's already done it. And I'll just jump down. Which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Drop down. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What's self-evident mean? Obvious. It's obvious that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and we know that. I just tell you this, there's presuppositions in the Declaration of Independence that if those presuppositions are not right, the argument falls apart. Number one, truth exists. Number two, there is a God. If there's no God, this falls apart. Because there's got to be something above the government. Otherwise, the government's not wrong. The government is God, Leviathan. Anyways, it's not a class. What the point is this. The Army says this is your moral and legal foundational documents of our nation. The big idea is what you will do based on law, what you ought to do based on morality, based on conscience. Now, it's assuming, and this is a big assumption, it's a rightly formed conscience. Because we need character development. Because we need to work on it. We're never done with it. Right? We're never done with it. And so when I was here, what we kind of came up with is we said, let's infantry proof this idea, and let's just ask two basic questions. Can I and should I? Because can I is a legal question. Do I have the authority to do this? Should I is a moral question. Yeah, I might have the authority to do it, but should I? Sometimes the answer is yes and yes. Sometimes it's no and yes. Sometimes it's no and no. And having a leader who's got a rightly, pointing moral compass, so to speak, is going to have to work through that. Can I and should I? Again, asking what? Is it ethical? Well, so you do that in order to say, okay, this is the Army ethic. How do you train that? Well, and maybe that you train that. I like the Army leadership, be no do. I've always liked that. You got to be that person first. I think we talked about it before. You got to model that first. You got to be that guy or gal that's like, I'm gonna do the right thing using that, but I'm gonna do what's legal and moral. I'm gonna model that. That's the B. Right? Then it assumes that I know it, and then do that I'm enforcing that. And then again, part of the do is I've got to train it. And I always go back to it's got to, and we mentioned it earlier, it's got to become a habit. And I think, what's the formula for a habit? And I just sketched it out, but I think a habit is like a skill or an ideal, one or the other, plus discipline, plus time. This is what a habit is, right? It's an ideal or a skill, something that you add discipline to, plus time, right? Because a habit's not, I went to the gym once last year. Yes, that's not a habit, right? Going to the gym may be, something you do, but you discipline yourself to do it over time, and it becomes a habit. Right, and Aristotle, we mentioned this morning, would talk about, you've got this sort of spectrum, virtue on one end, vice on the other end. He would mention there's these two things in between, continence and incontinence. And so what it was is a man or woman of virtue would know the right thing and do the right thing because of the right thing. A vicious person, a person of vice, would do the wrong thing for the wrong reason. But there's two people in the middle, one of them being the person who does the right thing for the wrong reason. That's not a virtuous person. You did the right thing, awesome, but you're not virtuous because you're not doing it for the right reason. Anyway, you get deep with this, but how do you train the professional ethic? Well, you've got to put it in some sort of framework. Everybody say this after me. 4, 3, 2, 1.
4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm going to give this in 4, 3, 2, 1. You've seen versions of this. We're working on this at Cal. I actually sent this to Mill Review just to kind of tweak to say, let's play around with it. But the goal is to put the Army ethic within the decision-making framework. And I love what Dr. Kilner says, moral integrity and moral judgment this morning. Moral integrity is sort of like, I know what's right, but am I going to do it? Do I have the moral courage to do it? Moral judgment is, I got to work what is right. And so this is sort of a what is right model that's sort of nested within the be, know, do. Because, and I'll just walk you through, right? So, and again, this is nothing new, what I'm showing you. It's been out there. I got to recognize a problem, evaluate, commit, and then act. I need moral courage to do that. Now, I put these in colors because, recognize the problem. When I recognize, a problem, I should probably do what? Stop. Now, the stop may be 5 seconds in combat. Or maybe 5 hours in a motor pool, or maybe 5 days in a staff group. But I need to stop, and then I need to proceed with caution. I need to go through some COAs to figure it out before I get to the green. Commit to decision, act. I need moral courage to do that. Right? That's all done in the context of character. And again, this is just our current leadership requirements model, but that's all done in character. All this is done within the context of who I am, who I've been building up to at that moment. Right? You only go to combat with the troops that you have at the time. I only make decisions with the character that I have at the time. So all of this is done in here. But intellectually, the know part, I've got to work on this. I've got to think about it. I've got to think deeply about it. In order to commit to a decision to act, which goes to the, leads, develops, and achieves. And oh, by the way, I better have others' counsel and feedback as I'm thinking this through. I better, right? We don't make decisions in a vacuum. Self-reflection is awesome, but if I self-reflect in a vacuum, I could just lead myself off a cliff. It's just like getting feedback. Feedback is awesome, but if all I listen to is feedback and never self-reflect, I can lead myself off a cliff. You got to do those in conjunction. You get good feedback and then process it. Process it and then get feedback, right? So that's what this model is that we sort of use. Where does the Army ethic fit in? Obviously, it fits in right here. Now, we don't think about thinking most of the time, and that's fine, because most of the time, it's between a green and a red shirt, I don't care. My wife's the one that's like, cares. I don't care. I just put on whatever. She's like, that doesn't look good. I don't care. Right? That's why I love the Army. One of the reasons I love the Army, because I get told this is what I'm wearing, right? I just don't think about things. I don't think about things until I do, right? Until there's something that does boom. Now I need to think. Combat leads to, I've got to think, right? So where does the Army ethic fit? I would say this. The old ADRP 1 used to say this: an action or decision is right if it's ethical, effective, and efficient. I think that's some pretty good criteria. I mean, could we do better? Maybe. But it's at least some criteria to start thinking about. Effective, ethical, effective, and efficient. As a military leader, I should think, is it ethical, effective, and efficient? Now, when I do that, I very oftentimes, and some may disagree with me, and that's okay, I always would start there. We're going to comment, is this going to work? Because if it's not going to work, I'm probably going to put it to the side. And I'm asked, is it going to work? And then I'm going to ask, is it ethical? Now, what I would say is, this is negotiable. And again, all these definitions are a little negotiable. But you know what? If we're talking about effectiveness, and I come to, I'm just going to use it. If I come to my boss, right, Jacob White, and say, Jacob White, here's some COAs, and it's like your first 2 COAs don't work. Well, you don't really have 3 COAs, right? You got 1 COA. So I need to come to him and say, here's 3 COAs that actually work. So then a question becomes, is it ethical? What I would tell you is that's non-negotiable. According to, and I'll go back real quick. If I can get this, I guess I should point it towards it, right? According to this, ethical is non-negotiable. Show me where effective is on there. Now, I mean, it's assumed, right? It's assumed. But ethical is implicit. Like, you will implicitly do ethical application of land power. So it's non-negotiable. Effectiveness, let's talk about, well, is it 100% effective, 90% effective? And I know it's not like binary like that, but we'll go back. And so the Army ethic helps answer what is ethical. Now, we've already talked about that. So we could break that out to say, okay, that's super general. Oh, but we've already talked about the Army ethic. So how do I know if it's ethical? Oh, it's legal and moral. Because that's going to help me answer whatever question I'm getting after. Well, how do I know it's legal and moral? And again, we don't have time. I've got 9 minutes until I want to be done. But I would tell you the Army has given us a pretty good starting point. I really like this box. Some people don't. But to me, this is a grid of, legal motivation of compliance. This is what you will do. Moral motivation of aspiration. This is what you ought to do. Like, this is the Army makes it pretty simple. And you know what? So, like, again, the Constitution, U.S. Code, that's just law. You got to follow the law. You got to follow the Constitution. You got to follow USCMJ. You got to follow executive order. Yeah, duh, we know this. So you go down, and we know this. But these morally you ought to do, which is like the Army values. You ought to live the Army values. I can't prosecute you if you don't. You're just so selfish. But you ought not to be. He's not. Right? He's not. You ought to live the golden rule. Why? Because the Army says so. Now, that's not the only reason, but I really like that the Army says so. Right? You could train your soldiers in the golden rule. We're about to create an LPD kit on the golden rule. Why? Because the Army says so. Every soldier should know the golden rule. And so what this does is it helps the decision making, right? So I have a decision make. I need to ask, is it ethical, effective, and efficient? Well, okay, we could talk what this is, but we go up here and talk what this is. But what's ethical? Oh, it's legal and moral. What's legal and moral? Oh, it's all this stuff. And so what we've basically done is when we look at our evaluation criteria, we're just asking, is it right? Okay, I've got a decision in LSCO. I got a decision at home. Is it ethical, effective, and efficient? I don't know. Is it ethical? I don't know. Is it moral and legal? Well, what's moral and legal? You're just basically asking, can I and should I? Can I and should I? Based on all of that. And one of the things we do, we train soldiers, man, what if you started asking this question all the time? Man, I'm about to go downtown. Can I and should I? Whoa, that could change your whole evening. And again, if I don't do right in Columbus, Georgia, man, I'm not going to do right in Kabul, Afghanistan. So training the ethic for LSCO starts here. And it starts now. And that's all unpacked here. I recognize the problem, I evaluate my options, commit, and then act. Now, again, do I do this most of the time? No, I almost never do this until I need it. And then when I need it, boy, I really need to use it. And so I told you 4, 3, 2, 1. What is it?
4, 3, 2, 1.
So kind of how I thought about it, there's 4 steps in the model. There's 3 E's to a right decision. There's 2 ethical questions to get 1 good result, right? 4, 3, embedded in that was the 2 and the 1. And so it's just, for me, it's just a quick, hey, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here's the steps. Boom, 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 boom. Why? But what's a right decision? Ethical, effective, and efficient. Okay, but what's ethical? Is it legal? Is it moral? Okay, what is you're trying to come up with the answer. Now again, no one's going to remember that. Firefight, crazy comment. No one's going to remember that unless you've been trained on it. Just like anything else. And so what I would tell you is it is a way to do it, to make moral decisions, to help with moral judgment. It's not the only way to do it, But usually if there's any leader pushback, my response would be, well, okay, what's your way to do it? And usually the answer is, I don't really have one. I'll critique it all day long, but I don't really have an answer. So the challenge is we need to be able to have an answer. And so if we're going to train the Army ethic, the professional ethic for LSCO, and as soon as we know what the ethic is to start with, we know the reason we're doing it, we know what it is, and we have some application of how to do this. Now, let me just pause real quick. I got one more slide after this, but just any questions, comments? Life, the universe, anything? Yeah.
Sir, both myself and Chap King over at Warren Army Community Hospital, and I think he's touched a lot about ethics along with our civilian population. But one of the questions I have is, if we have a soldier who is morally bound by his religious beliefs to not give blood or even take vaccines for any religious reason, but a doctor says, I don't care, we're gonna do it anyways. Isn't that ethically against and morally against the soldier's beliefs?
Yeah. In fact, what Army doctrine says currently is if you come up against anything that's illegal, immoral, or unethical, you should do two things: reject and report. ADP 622, page 1-3, 1-4. Well, I think that's immoral. Okay. Now, here's the question. Does he have to take it? The answer is no. Now, here's the other thing. Does he have to stay in the Army? No. It's nobody's right to stay in the Army. But he does not have to take it. I'm assuming it's a he. Sorry, he or she. Does not have to take it. We dealt with this in COVID. Now listen, what drove me nuts with COVID is commanders would just emotionally just, and I would have to walk. I was here during it, and I would, shh. No soldier has to do this. I should just take it. No. You have to. And you shouldn't apply pressure. It's their decision, morally. We hadn't crossed this bridge before. I said, don't get all emotional, and I'd walk them through this logic. You want your soldiers to think through this deeply. Now, again, okay, you disagree with them. Noted, got it. This is the policy. Okay, this is the morality of it. Again, their morality skewed. Okay, maybe, but hear me. No soldier should do anything against his or her moral judgment, period. Now, again, does that mean I'm not going to have consequences for it? Absolutely not. You may not stay in the Army, and that's okay too. But no soldier should have to do something that goes, and I would use the Army ethic, and I would go to 622, and I would outline it. I'd do a class with all commanders and say, here it is, don't get emotional about it. Just know that this is what we do. And again, cool, we're just going to do some administrative stuff. And again, that's just how it is. So, yeah, I think they were following the Army ethic because you reject and report. No, I reject it. I don't want it. Report. How do you report? You go to your chain of command. Say, I want an exemption for it. The exemption may come back, no. Okay, then what are you going to do? You're going to separate. And there's emotions attached, but it doesn't have to be emotional. It's very thought out and this is my ethical decision-making process. So I think it's a good question. Sir?
Doesn't it have to be manifestly immoral or illegal? Because,
No.
I mean, they all took an oath to obey the orders of the officers appointed
Right.
over them, which gives them a presumption that they have to.
The presumption is you ought to.
That you ought to.
That you ought to, yes, sir. But no, the way it's written, it's
Not manifest.
It's not manifest, no, sir. And that's what, and some people do, we don't like that wording, because then we get, particularly the more pluralistic we get, the wider that becomes. And the answer is, yeah, that's true. So again, that's where we're at. But that's a great point. And so, but now, no, it's just sort of illegal or immoral. Well, immoral to who? And again, I would go back to that chart because again, that's this. And again, I made this chart up, which is why it's not super professional looking. But that's the logic of it, and you see that. You see the Army doctrine actually talks about individual conscience. So that's the logic of it, the organizational and individual conscience. So give me an example of organizational conscience, because we don't talk like that. But can somebody give me an example of what I mean by So both of these are organizational. This sort of is, again, like regulations, because regulations kind of act as law. They're not, but they kind of act that way. What would be an example of organizational conscience?
Don't do that.
Well, yeah. Yes, I mean, so that, but maybe codified. So that's what I'm looking for, codified.
Just went through one at Eyeballing, mustaches.
Okay.
Infantry officers don't wear mustaches.
Okay, but that's not codified, right? I'll give you I'll throw out what I'm looking for.
Regulation, no. Is it a policy that is also written as a standard? Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Again, you're not. But I'm talking a whole army. I'll just give it to you. Army values, organizational conscience, warrior ethos, organizational conscience, attributes of character that we have in doctrine: empathy, humility, and discipline. I mean, there's nothing like if you lack empathy, you're not going to be prosecuted. I mean, in doctrine, it says you ought to have empathy. So these would be, so that's what I'm looking for. Again, you both are right. I mean, those kind of are unit specific or organization specific. And I guess what I was getting at is just army-wide conscience.
Or even something else on your left, patch on your shoulder, right? Air assault, right? Under first, there's nothing that specifically says you absolutely have to go to air assault school. We had to go to air assault school, right? Like it's.
Yeah, I mean that one. I mean, well, yeah, you probably say a chaplain. I really don't need to go, but yeah, but anyways, we could talk that piece. Let me give you this, and I'm gonna let you go. My goal was to do three things, just to say, hey, if we're going to talk teaching and training the professional ethic, which is the Army ethic, we need to have a baseline of why are we doing that. So we got at that. Then we're going to talk about this is what it is, and then this is how it stands, and then just some ways to apply it. And again, it applies in sort of that ethical decision-making rubric. Again, you don't think about it a lot because you don't need to think about it a lot, but you do need to think about it when you do. And so I'll leave you with a quote, and it's one of my favorite little quotes when we talk about sort of ethics. Walzer says, "For war is the hardest place. If comprehensive and consistent moral judgments are possible there, they're possible anywhere." And what I always like to do is I like to flip it, though. If you can't make the right decision anywhere, you won't make the right decision in war. You just won't, right? You're going to go with the character that has been built. You're going to go with the ethical framework that has been built. And so we need to be pouring in to those people who are under us so that when we do find ourselves in some really hard spots, we can make the right decision. All right, thanks so much. Appreciate you.